The projector screen went black. Laughter erupted through the chemistry lab as Sarah Chun stood frozen at the front of the classroom, her carefully prepared molecular bonding presentation reduced to nothing but a blank wall. 3 students in. The back row exchanged triumphant grins, one of them casually sliding a USB drive back into his pocket. They had no idea they'd just awakened something that had been dormant for 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chun had always been the type of person who blended into crowds. At 32, she possessed an almost ethereal quietness that made people speak softer around her, as if her presence demanded a certain reverence. Her colleagues at Riverside Community College often mistook this tranquility for weakness. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Behind her wire-rimmed glasses and gentle smile lay the disciplined mind of someone who had spent 2 decades mastering the art of redirecting force rather than meeting it head-on. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, Sarah had been the daughter of immigrants who valued education above all else. Her father, a mechanical engineer, and her mother, a librarian, had enrolled her in Aikido classes at age 7, not for self-defense, but for discipline and focus. What started as an after-school activity became a lifelong passion. By 18, she held a second-degree black belt and had trained under some of the most respected senseis on the West Coast. The philosophy of Aikido resonated deeply with Sarah's natural temperament. Unlike other martial arts that emphasize striking and aggression, Aikido taught practitioners to blend with an attacker's energy, using their own force against them. It was an art of circles and spheres, of redirecting rather than blocking, of finding harmony even in conflict. These principles shaped not just her physical movements, but her entire approach to life. After completing her master's degree in chemistry at Oregon State University, Sarah had spent several years working in pharmaceutical research. The work was fulfilling but isolating, conducted mostly in sterile laboratories with minimal human interaction. When budget cuts eliminated her position, she found herself at a crossroads. Teaching had never been part of her original plan, but something about the idea of sharing knowledge, of connecting with young minds, appealed to her nurturing nature. Riverside Community College wasn't prestigious, but it served a diverse student population in the heart of California's Central Valley. Many students came from working-class families, first-generation college attendees seeking better opportunities. Sarah saw potential in this environment, a chance to make a real difference in lives that might otherwise lack direction. Her interview had gone smoothly. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, the department head, was impressed by Sarah's credentials and her soft-spoken passion for chemistry. The position was temporary at first, filling in for Professor Williams, who was on medical leave. But there was potential for it to become permanent if things worked out well. Sarah spent weeks preparing for her first semester. She redesigned the curriculum to make complex chemical concepts more accessible, created interactive presentations, and even planned hands-on experiments that would bring abstract theories to life. Her apartment became a workshop of educational materials, molecular models, and carefully crafted lesson plans. She believed that if she could just show students how beautiful and logical chemistry could be, they would develop the same appreciation she had for the subject. The first day of classes in September had been promising. Sarah introduced herself to 3 different chemistry sections, explaining her background and her teaching philosophy. Most students seemed engaged, asking thoughtful questions about the coursework and her research experience. She felt optimistic about the semester ahead, but by the second week, she began to notice patterns that troubled her. In her afternoon Introduction to Organic Chemistry class, a small group of students consistently arrived late, sat in the back corner, and seemed more interested in their phones than the lesson. 3 students in particular stood out. Marcus Rivera, a stocky 19-year-old with an attitude that suggested the world owed him something. Jessica Walsh, whose designer clothes and dismissive expressions marked her as someone accustomed to getting her way. And Danny Kowalski, quiet but malicious, the type who smiled while planning cruelty. At first, their disruptions were subtle. Whispered conversations during lectures, exaggerated sighs when Sarah assigned homework, the occasional snicker when she stumbled over a word. Sarah tried to address it diplomatically, making eye contact during lessons, gently redirecting attention when necessary. She even stayed after class to offer additional help, thinking perhaps they were struggling with the material. The trio's behavior escalated gradually. Marcus began making comments under his breath about boring Asian teachers, loud enough for others to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Jessica started a group chat where she shared unflattering photos of Sarah taken during class, adding mocking captions about her outdated clothes and weird teaching style. Danny, meanwhile, became the group's technical expert, researching ways to disrupt Sarah's carefully planned lessons. Other students began to notice the hostile atmosphere. Some seemed uncomfortable with the trio's behavior, but none spoke up. Sarah represented authority, and in the social hierarchy of college, authority figures were fair game. The rest of the class maintained a careful neutrality, not wanting to become targets themselves. Sarah tried various approaches to manage the situation. She spoke with each student individually after class, expressing concern about their academic performance and offering support. Marcus shrugged off her attempts with barely concealed contempt. Jessica smiled sweetly while making it clear she had no intention of changing her behavior. Danny said nothing at all, just stared at her with cold, calculating eyes. The breaking point came during the fourth week of the semester. Sarah had prepared an elaborate presentation on molecular bonding theory, complete with animated diagrams and interactive elements. She'd spent hours perfecting the timing, ensuring that each concept built logically on the previous one. This particular lesson was crucial for understanding more advanced topics later in the semester. As she set up her laptop and connected it to the classroom's projection system, Sarah noticed Danny watching her with unusual interest. She thought perhaps he was finally showing genuine engagement with the material. How wrong she was. The presentation began smoothly. Sarah explained how atoms formed bonds, sharing electrons to achieve stability. She showed beautiful visualizations of molecular structures, their three-dimensional arrangements dancing across the screen. Students seemed captivated by the visual representations of concepts they'd only read about in textbooks. 20 minutes into the lesson, just as Sarah reached the critical explanation of covalent bonding, the screen went black. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Sarah clicked her remote repeatedly, but nothing happened. She checked the laptop connections, restarted the presentation software, even unplugged and reconnected the entire system. Nothing worked. Behind her she heard the distinctive sound of suppressed laughter. Turning around, she saw Marcus, Jessica, and Danny exchanging looks of barely contained triumph. Danny's hand moved almost imperceptibly as he slipped something into his backpack. At that moment, Sarah understood exactly what had happened. Rest of the class period became an exercise in improvisation. Sarah attempted to recreate her presentation using only the whiteboard, but the complex molecular diagrams that had taken hours to animate were impossible to replicate by hand. Students grew restless, checking their phones and whispering among themselves. What should have been an engaging, memorable lesson became a disjointed struggle to convey information without her primary teaching tools. As the class period ended and students filed out, Sarah remained at the front of the room, staring at the blank projection screen. She thought about the hours of preparation that had been wasted, the educational opportunity that had been stolen not just from her, but from every student in the room. More than that, she thought about the pattern of disrespect that had been building for weeks. The way these three students had systematically undermined her authority and disrupted the learning environment for Everyone else standing there in the empty classroom, surrounded by the molecular models and equipment she'd brought to make chemistry come alive for her students. Sarah felt something shift inside her. The Aikido principles she'd lived by for over 2 decades suddenly took on new meaning. Sometimes, she realized, harmony could only be achieved by redirecting destructive forces back onto themselves. The trio had no idea what they'd awakened. They saw only a quiet, seemingly fragile teacher who hadn't fought back against their campaign of harassment. They didn't know about the countless hours Sarah had spent on training mats, learning to sense an opponent's intentions before they even moved. They didn't understand that true strength often appeared as gentleness, and that the most devastating responses sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. As Sarah began packing up her materials, her movements carried a new sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity, another class period, another chance for these students to test her resolve. But tomorrow she will be ready in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. The projection screen might have gone dark, but something else was just beginning to illuminate. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's office. Dr. Margaret Hoffman stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and administrative caution. At 58, the department head had seen enough faculty struggles to recognize when a situation was spiraling beyond normal classroom management issues. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes?" Dr. Hoffman asked, settling into the small chair across from Sarah's desk. The office was cramped but organized, filled with chemistry journals and molecular models that caught the morning light streaming through the single window. "Of course," Sarah replied, though she suspected she knew what this conversation would entail. "I received some feedback about yesterday's class," Dr. Hoffman began carefully. "Apparently there were technical difficulties with your presentation." Sarah chose her words thoughtfully. "The projection system failed during a critical part of the lesson. I managed to adapt, but it definitely impacted the effectiveness of the material." What Sarah didn't mention was the email she'd found in her inbox that morning. Someone had created an anonymous account and sent her a message containing screenshots from a group chat. The images showed her struggling at the whiteboard, accompanied by mocking commentary from students she couldn't identify. The final message was particularly cutting. "Maybe stick to easier topics, teach. Some of us aren't here for amateur hour." Dr. Hoffman leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, I want you to know that teaching challenges are completely normal, especially in your first semester. These students can be demanding, but I've also heard some concerning reports about classroom management issues." The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah understood the subtext perfectly. In academic environments, student complaints carried significant weight, regardless of their validity. A few strategic comments from influential students could derail a career before it even began. "What kind of reports?" Sarah asked. "Nothing specific, just general concerns about engagement and classroom atmosphere. Look, I'm not here to criticize, I want to help. Maybe we could arrange for some peer observation? Professor Martinez has excellent classroom management skills." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Peer observation was often the first step in building a case for non-renewal. "I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to handle this myself for now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Dr. Hoffman nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "Just remember, Sarah, we're all here to support you. Don't let pride get in the way of asking for help when you need it." After Dr. Hoffman left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at the molecular model of caffeine on her desk. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was a molecule that stimulated alertness and focus, yet she felt more confused than ever about how to handle her situation. The problem extended beyond simple classroom disruption. Marcus, Jessica, and Danny had systematically begun recruiting others to their cause. During her next class, Sarah noticed new faces among the skeptical looks and suppressed laughter. Students who had previously shown genuine interest in chemistry now seemed distracted, constantly checking their phones and exchanging meaningful glances. The trio's tactics had evolved as well. Instead of obvious disruptions, they employed more sophisticated psychological warfare. Marcus would ask seemingly innocent questions designed to expose gaps in Sarah's knowledge or catch her in minor inconsistencies. Jessica perfected the art of the eye roll, timing her expressions of disgust to maximize their impact on surrounding students. Danny remained silent but present, his laptop screen always angled away from Sarah's view, his fingers constantly typing messages she couldn't see. Sarah tried to adapt her teaching style to counter their influence. She incorporated more group activities, hoping to break up the toxic dynamic that had formed in the back corner of the classroom. She offered extra credit opportunities to encourage genuine engagement. She even brought in demonstrations with dry ice and color-changing reactions, attempting to recapture the wonder that had initially drawn her to chemistry. Nothing worked. The trio had successfully created an atmosphere where challenging the teacher was not only acceptable but expected. Other students, initially neutral, began to adopt similar attitudes. Sarah watched her carefully crafted lesson plans crumble under the weight of constant, low-level hostility. The breaking point came during a laboratory session in the third week of October. Sarah had planned a synthesis experiment where students would create aspirin from salicylic acid, a practical application that usually generated excitement about chemistry's real-world relevance. The procedure required precise measurements and careful attention to safety protocols. Sarah demonstrated the process first, explaining each step while students gathered around the central lab bench. She emphasized the importance of accurate measurements, proper heating techniques, and the chemical reactions occurring at each stage. Most students seemed engaged, asking questions about yields and purification methods. As groups dispersed to their individual workstations, Sarah began circulating to provide guidance and answer questions. She noticed Danny working alone at a station near the chemical storage area, which was unusual since lab exercises were typically conducted in pairs. When she approached to offer assistance, he quickly closed his lab notebook and moved to join Jessica and Marcus at a different station. 20 minutes into the experiment, chaos erupted. A student named Ashley Rodriguez suddenly screamed as her mixture began producing thick, acrid smoke. The entire lab filled with a pungent odor that sent students stumbling toward the exits, covering their noses and coughing violently. Sarah immediately activated the emergency ventilation system and began evacuating the room. Her training kicked in as she ensured all students were safely outside before returning to assess the situation. Ashley's reaction vessel contained a bubbling, discolored mess that bore no resemblance to the clear solution the experiment should have produced. "What happened?" Sarah asked Ashley once they were safely in the hallway. Ashley, tears streaming down her face from the chemical irritation, shook her head. "I followed the procedure exactly. I don't understand what went wrong." Sarah examined Ashley's lab notebook, noting that the measurements and steps appeared correct. But something nagged at her about the incident. The timing was too convenient, occurring just as she'd been distracted by Danny's unusual behavior. As the emergency response team cleared the lab and deemed it safe for re-entry, Sarah discovered that several chemical bottles in the storage area had been moved from their usual positions. A bottle of concentrated hydrochloric acid, normally stored with other acids, sat among the bases. The safety cap on a container of sodium hydroxide appeared loose. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately tampered with the chemical storage, knowing that a student would inevitably make a mistake that could result in a dangerous reaction. The sabotage wasn't just aimed at disrupting her lesson. It had put actual lives at risk. Dr. Hoffman arrived within minutes of the incident report. She conducted a brief interview with Ashley and reviewed the lab procedures, but found no obvious explanation for the accident. Sarah wanted to voice her suspicions about the tampered chemicals, but knew how it would sound. A struggling teacher blaming students for what appeared to be her own failure to maintain proper lab safety. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured, Dr. Hoffman said as they stood outside the cleared laboratory. But Sarah, this is exactly the kind of incident that can have serious consequences. We need to review all safety protocols and make sure something like this doesn't happen again. Sarah nodded, understanding the warning beneath the administrative language. One more incident like this could end her career before it truly began. That evening, alone in her apartment, Sarah knelt on her meditation mat for the first time in months. She had installed a small shrine in the corner of her living room, complete with a photo of her deceased sensei and a small statue of a seated Buddha. The familiar ritual of centering herself brought a clarity that had been missing for weeks. In Aikido, she remembered, the most dangerous opponents were those who disguised their aggression as accident or coincidence. They tested boundaries gradually, escalating only when they sensed weakness or uncertainty in their target. The key to dealing with such opponents was not to meet their deception with confrontation, but to remain centered and alert, waiting for the moment when their true intentions revealed themselves. As Sarah sat in silence, breathing deeply and feeling her heartbeat slow, she began to formulate a different approach to her classroom challenges. She had been trying to fight the trio's influence through conventional educational methods, appealing to their better nature and hoping to redirect their energy toward learning. But perhaps conventional methods weren't appropriate for an unconventional problem. Perhaps it was time to apply the deeper lessons her Aikido training had taught her about reading intentions, sensing hidden aggression, and responding with precisely calibrated force. The trio thought they were playing a game with a helpless opponent. They had no idea they were about to discover what happened when someone with 2 decades of martial arts training decided to stop playing defense and start redirecting their energy back at them. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities, Sarah intended to be ready. Sarah arrived at Riverside Community College 45 minutes before her first class, carrying a small black bag she hadn't brought to campus before. Inside were items that most people would consider unremarkable: a digital voice recorder no larger than a USB drive, a small mirror designed for checking blind spots, and a smartphone with a particular app that could detect when devices were attempting to connect to nearby networks. The tools weren't for gathering evidence in any legal sense. Sarah's Aikido training had taught her that information was power, and power could be redirected just as effectively as physical force. If Marcus, Jessica, and Danny wanted to play games of deception and sabotage, she would meet them with perfect awareness of their tactics. Her first stop was the chemistry lab where yesterday's incident had occurred. The morning custodial staff had already completed their routine cleaning, but Sarah conducted her own careful inspection. She noted which chemical containers had been replaced, which storage areas showed signs of disturbance, and most importantly, which security cameras covered different angles of the room. Riverside's security system was outdated but functional. Sarah had never paid attention to the small black domes mounted in classroom corners, but now she studied their positioning with tactical interest. The lab had 3 cameras, one covering the main entrance, one focused on the demonstration area, and one with a wide-angle view of the storage section where yesterday's sabotage had occurred. Sarah made a mental note to request footage from yesterday's session, though she suspected the request would be buried in administrative bureaucracy until the incident was forgotten. That was fine. She had other methods of gathering intelligence. Her office hours that morning brought an unexpected visitor. Ashley Rodriguez knocked hesitantly on the doorframe, still looking shaken from the previous day's chemical accident. "Professor Chun, do you have a minute?" "Of course, Ashley. Please, sit down. How are you feeling?" Ashley settled into the chair, fidgeting with her backpack straps. I'm okay physically, but I keep thinking about what happened. I've done that synthesis before in high school, a P chemistry. I know I followed the procedure correctly. Sarah maintained a neutral expression while studying Ashley's body language. The student was clearly troubled by more than just academic confusion. Sometimes laboratory accidents happen, even when we follow proper procedures, Sarah said carefully. Equipment can malfunction, chemicals can be contaminated, ... That's just it, Ashley interrupted. I've been thinking about the setup. When I got to my station, some of the chemicals were already out on the bench. Danny Kowalski said he'd grabbed them for our section since he got there early. But now I'm wondering. Ashley trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of her suspicions. What are you wondering, Ashley? Do you think someone might have switched the chemicals? I mean, deliberately? Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with concern. Ashley's testimony confirmed her suspicions, but it also meant an innocent student had been used as an unwitting weapon in the trio's escalating campaign. That's a serious accusation, Sarah said. Do you have any evidence to support it? Ashley shook her head. Just a feeling. And the fact that Danny seemed really interested in which station I was using. He kept asking if I needed help, which was weird, because he's never spoken to me before. I appreciate you coming to me with this, Ashley. If you ever feel unsafe in the laboratory, please let me know immediately. After Ashley left, Sarah spent several minutes processing the conversation. The trio's tactics were becoming increasingly sophisticated and dangerous. What had started as classroom disruption was evolving into something that could cause serious harm to innocent students. That afternoon's class began with an unusual level of tension. Word about the laboratory incident had spread throughout the Prude student body, and Sarah could sense the mixture of curiosity and apprehension in the room. Some students seemed genuinely concerned about safety, while others appeared to be waiting for another dramatic incident. Marcus, Jessica, and Danny occupied their usual back corner, but their demeanor had changed. Where they had previously been openly disruptive, they now maintained a facade of model behavior. They took notes, asked reasonable questions, and participated in discussions with apparent sincerity. Sarah recognized the shift immediately. They were establishing alibis, creating a record of good behavior that could be referenced if their previous actions came under scrutiny. It was a calculated move that demonstrated a level of strategic thinking she hadn't previously credited them with. During the lesson on reaction kinetics, Sarah introduced a concept that required students to work in pairs on calculations. As groups formed naturally throughout the room, she noticed Danny deliberately positioning himself near the main electrical outlets that powered the classroom's projection system. Sarah continued her lecture, while keeping Danny in her peripheral vision. Halfway through the partner exercise, she saw him glance around the room before reaching into his backpack. His hand emerged with what appeared to be a small device, possibly a USB drive or wireless transmitter, without breaking the flow of her explanation about activation energy. Sarah moved casually toward the back of the classroom. She positioned herself at an angle where she could observe Danny's actions while appearing to help other students with their calculations. Danny's movements were subtle, but purposeful. He bent down as if retrieving a dropped pen, and Sarah saw him insert something into a power strip that fed the projection system. The device was small enough to be mistaken for a standard adapter, but Sarah's heightened awareness caught the deception. Mr. Kowalski, Sarah said pleasantly, could you help me demonstrate the next concept to the class? Danny straightened quickly, his hand moving away from the power strip. Sure, Professor Chun. Sarah guided him to the front of the classroom, effectively removing him from proximity to whatever device he had just installed. For the remainder of the class period, she kept him engaged in helping with demonstrations, all while monitoring Marcus and Jessica for any coordinated activities. Trio's frustration was palpable but contained. They had planned some form of technical sabotage for today's lesson, but Sarah's tactical awareness had neutralized their attempt without creating any obvious confrontation. After class, Sarah remained in the room until all students had departed. She then approached the power strip where Danny had been working and examined it carefully. Among the standard adapters and charging cables, she found a small black device she didn't recognize. It appeared to be some form of signal interceptor or transmitter, designed to blend in with legitimate electronic equipment. Sarah photographed the device from multiple angles using her phone, documenting its position and appearance before carefully removing it. She placed it in a small evidence bag she had brought for exactly this purpose. That evening, Sarah visited her former sensei's dojo in downtown Fresno, a 40-minute drive from Riverside. Sensei Michael Tanaka was now in his 70s, but his movements still possessed the fluid precision that had first attracted Sarah to Aikido as a child. Sarah-chan, he greeted her using the diminutive form he had employed since her childhood. It has been too long. You carry tension in your shoulders. Sarah bowed respectfully before settling onto the tatami mats in Tanaka's private office. The room was sparse but peaceful, decorated only with calligraphy scrolls and a few photographs of Aikido masters from previous generations. Sensei, I need guidance about applying our principles in a non-physical confrontation. Tanaka nodded thoughtfully. The way of Eiki extends far beyond the dojo. Tell me about this conflict. Sarah described her situation without naming specific individuals or institutions. She spoke about opponents who used deception and manipulation, who endangered innocent people while maintaining facades of respectability. In Aikido, Tanaka said, we speak of irimi and tenken, entering and turning. Sometimes we must step directly into conflict to redirect it properly. But timing is everything. Enter too early and you meet unnecessary resistance. Enter too late and the opportunity for harmonious resolution is lost. How do I know when the timing is right? When your opponents commit fully to their attack. When they overextend themselves in pursuit of what they believe is certain victory. At that moment, their force becomes the source of their defeat. Sarah spent an hour working through Kata with Tanaka, practicing the flowing movements that had become second nature over 2 decades of training. The physical practice helped clear her mind and reminded her that Aikido was as much about mental discipline as physical technique. Driving back to Riverside that night, Sarah felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. The trio was escalating their campaign, becoming bolder and more dangerous with each incident. They believed they had found a victim who wouldn't fight back effectively. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. The next phase of their conflict would require Sarah to step directly into their attacks, to enter the circle of their aggression with perfect timing and redirect their destructive energy back upon themselves. She had spent too long trying to avoid confrontation. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching them lessons they would never forget. The anonymous email arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night, sent from a newly created account with no identifying information. Sarah read it twice before fully grasping its implications. Professor Chen, thought you should know that certain students have been coordinating their efforts against you. Check the 3rd floor study room tomorrow at 2:15 p.m. if you want to understand what you're really dealing with. A concerned observer. Sarah stared at her laptop screen, weighing the message's authenticity. It could be a trap, another layer in the trio's increasingly sophisticated psychological warfare. But it could also be exactly what it appeared to be, intelligence from someone who had witnessed their planning sessions. She decided to investigate, but carefully. The next morning brought unexpected developments from multiple directions. Dr. Hoffman's secretary called to schedule an urgent meeting for Friday afternoon, citing ongoing classroom concerns that require immediate attention. The language was ominous. suggesting that complaints about Sarah's teaching had reached a critical mass. More troubling was a conversation she overheard while passing through the faculty lounge. Professor Martinez was speaking quietly with Dr. Williams, the chemistry instructor whose medical leave Sarah was covering. The students seem quite dissatisfied, Dr. Williams was saying. Apparently there have been multiple safety incidents and technical failures. Margaret is concerned about liability issues. Sarah continued past without acknowledging the conversation, but the implications were clear. Her position was being evaluated, and the narrative surrounding her performance was already being shaped by her opponent's campaign. At 2:10 p.m., Sarah positioned herself in a rarely used stairwell that provided a view of the third-floor study room mentioned in the anonymous email. She carried a textbook and notebook to maintain the appearance of normal academic business, but her attention was focused entirely on observing who entered and exited the room. At exactly 2:15, Marcus arrived carrying a laptop bag and what appeared to be recording equipment. Jessica followed 3 minutes later, accompanied by 2 students Sarah didn't recognize from her classes. Danny was the last to arrive, slipping into the room with characteristic stealth. Sarah waited 5 more minutes before moving closer. The study room's door was closed, but a small window provided limited visibility. She could see Marcus gesturing animatedly while the others leaned in around his laptop screen. Whatever they were planning required coordination and technical preparation. Using her phone's voice recording app, Sarah positioned herself as close to the door as possible while maintaining plausible deniability. The hallway's acoustic properties carried fragments of conversation, though not enough to understand complete sentences. She caught key phrases: Friday's presentation, complete system failure, and most chilling, make sure she can't recover. This time, the meeting lasted 27 minutes, with participants departing individually at staggered intervals. Sarah returned to her office with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Friday's class was scheduled to cover chemical equilibrium, a complex topic that required extensive visual aids and interactive demonstrations. She had spent weeks preparing what she considered her most important lesson of the semester, designed to help students understand one of chemistry's most fundamental principles. Now, she knew it would also be the setting for the trio's most ambitious sabotage attempt yet. That evening, Sarah made 2 crucial phone calls. The first was to her brother David, a cybersecurity specialist working for a tech company in San Jose. Without revealing specific details about her situation, she asked him about methods for protecting digital presentations from technical interference. Depends on what kind of interference you're worried about, David said. Are we talking about network intrusions, hardware failures, or deliberate sabotage? Potentially all 3. David was quiet for a moment. Sarah, are you in some kind of trouble? This sounds like industrial espionage level paranoia. I'm just trying to be prepared for worst-case scenarios. Okay, well, the best defense is redundancy and isolation. Multiple backup systems, air-gap devices, hard copy materials. Make it impossible for any single point of failure to derail your entire presentation. The second call was to Ashley Rodriguez. Sarah had noticed that Ashley often stayed late in the library, and she suspected the student might have additional insights about the trio's activities. Ashley, this is Professor Chen. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to follow up on our conversation about laboratory safety. Oh, hi, Professor. No, I don't mind at all. Actually, I'm glad you called. I've been thinking more about what happened, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't imagining things. What do you mean? I've been paying more attention to Danny and his friends since our talk. They have these planning meetings in the third-floor study room. I've seen them with recording equipment and what looks like hacking tools. Sarah felt a chill of validation. Ashley's independent observations confirmed her own surveillance. Have you told anyone else about this? No, and honestly, I'm kind of scared too. These aren't just pranks anymore. What they did in the lab could have really hurt someone. And I think they're planning something bigger. Ashley, I want you to promise me something. If you see any unusual activity in tomorrow's class, or if you feel unsafe for any reason, I want you to leave immediately. Don't worry about your grade or participation points. Just get out. Professor Chun, are you expecting something to happen? Sarah chose her words carefully. I'm just being cautious. But I want all my students to be safe. After ending the call, Sarah spent the remainder of the evening implementing David's advice. She created multiple backup versions of her presentation on different devices, prepared detailed handwritten notes that could substitute for digital materials, and even recorded audio versions of key explanations that could be played from her phone if necessary. More importantly, she began preparing herself mentally for what was coming. The trio had been escalating their attack steadily, and tomorrow's incident would likely represent their most ambitious attempt yet. They believed they had identified her breaking point and were preparing to push her beyond it. What they didn't understand was that Aikido practitioners didn't break under pressure. They bent, flowed, and redirected energy in ways that opponents could never anticipate. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with November fog rolling across the Central Valley campus. Sarah arrived 2 hours early to conduct a thorough inspection of her classroom. She tested every piece of equipment, examined all electrical connections, and even checked the ventilation system for signs of tampering. At 10:30 a.m., she received a text message from an unknown number. Hope you're ready for your big day, teach. Some lessons can't be learned from books. Sarah deleted the message without responding, but photographed it first for documentation. The psychological pressure was intensifying, designed to make her anxious and prone to mistakes. Instead, she used the threat as a focal point for centering herself. Students began arriving for the 11 a.m. class at 10:45. Sarah noticed several unfamiliar faces among the usual attendees, suggesting that word about today's anticipated drama had spread beyond her enrolled students. Marcus, Jessica, and Danny arrived separately but took their usual positions in the back corner. Sarah began her presentation on chemical equilibrium with perfect calm, explaining how reactions could proceed in both forward and reverse directions until reaching a state of dynamic balance. The irony of the topic wasn't lost on her. She was about to demonstrate a very different kind of equilibrium 20 minutes into the lesson. As she reached the critical explanation of Le Chatelier's principle, the first wave of sabotage began. The projector screen flickered once, twice, then went completely black. Simultaneously, her laptop made a harsh electronic noise and shut down completely. The room fell silent, except for the sound of suppressed laughter from the back corner. Sarah looked calmly at the dead equipment, then at her students, and finally at the three faces she knew were responsible. "Well," she said quietly, "I suppose this gives us an opportunity to discuss a different kind of reaction." She moved toward the back of the classroom with the fluid grace of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The trio was about to learn that some equilibriums could only be restored through the application of perfectly directed force. Time seemed to crystallize as Sarah moved through the classroom with purposeful calm. Her footsteps made no sound on the polished floor. Her breathing remained steady and controlled. 23 students watched in fascination as their mild-mannered chemistry professor transformed before their eyes into something they had never witnessed before. Marcus leaned back in his chair with theatrical confidence, arms crossed, and a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He had orchestrated this moment for weeks, believing he had finally cornered his prey. Jessica pulled out her phone to record what she assumed would be Sarah's final breakdown and resignation. Danny's hand hovered near his laptop, ready to trigger whatever additional surprises he had prepared. None of them noticed the subtle shift in Sarah's posture, the way her center of gravity had lowered, or how her hands had assumed positions that Looked casual, but were actually preparatory stances from decades of martial arts training. "You know," Sarah said conversationally as she approached their corner, "chemical equilibrium is fascinating because it demonstrates how systems respond to external pressure. When you try to force a reaction in one direction, nature finds a way to push back." Marcus's smirk widened. "Yeah, well, maybe some reactions just can't be controlled, Professor Chen." "You're absolutely right, Marcus. Sometimes the only way to restore balance is to let the natural forces play out completely." Sarah stopped exactly 3 feet from Marcus's desk, close enough that her presence commanded attention, but far enough to maintain proper distance. She could see the small device Danny had connected to the power strip, could smell the faint odor of overheated electronics from whatever he had done to sabotage her laptop. "I'm curious about something," Sarah continued, her voice remaining perfectly level. "The equipment failure today, was that the same kind of technical difficulty that affected Ashley's experiment last week?" Jessica looked up from her phone, suddenly alert to the shift in Sarah's tone. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that someone in this room has been deliberately sabotaging equipment, endangering students, and interfering with the educational process. And I think we all know who that someone is." Danny finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of calculated innocence. "That's a pretty serious accusation, Professor. Do you have any proof?" Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew the small black device she had photographed and removed from the power strip 2 days earlier. She placed it gently on Marcus's desk. "You mean proof like this signal interceptor you installed on Tuesday? Or the testimony from Ashley Rodriguez about contaminated chemicals? Or perhaps the planning session you held yesterday in the third-floor study room?" The blood drained from Danny's face. Jessica's phone trembled in her grip. Marcus, however, doubled down on his aggressive posture. "You've been spying on us." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's harassment. That's an invasion of privacy. We're going to file a complaint with the administration." "Please do," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm sure Dr. Hoffman would be very interested in reviewing the security footage from the chemistry lab, along with the evidence I've gathered about your systematic campaign of sabotage." Marcus took a step closer to Sarah, his hands clenched into fists. At 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, he had spent his entire life using physical intimidation to get his way. He assumed that a small, quiet woman would naturally back down when confronted with aggressive male presence. He had no idea that Sarah had been training for exactly this moment since she was 7 years old. "You can't prove anything," Marcus snarled, now standing close enough that Sarah could smell the energy drink on his breath. "It's your word against ours, and guess what? Nobody believes in crazy teachers who can't even keep their equipment working." Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing unchanged, her expression serene. But every student in the room could sense the subtle shift in atmosphere, as if the air itself had become charged with potential energy. "Marcus, I need you to step back," Sarah said quietly. "Or what?" Marcus moved even closer, now invading Sarah's personal space in a way that would intimidate most people. "What are you going to do about it?" Sarah's response was so fast that most students missed the initial movement. In one fluid motion, she pivoted slightly to her left, stepped forward with her right foot, and grasped Marcus's extended wrist with both hands. Before he could react, she had turned her body 90 degrees and used his own forward momentum to execute a perfect Irimidage throw. Marcus flew through the air in a graceful arc, landing hard on his back between the rows of desks. The sound of his impact echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. Jessica screamed and dropped her phone. Danny scrambled backward, knocking over his chair and sending his laptop crashing to the floor. The other students sat frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood calmly over Marcus's prone form, her hands now relaxed at her sides. "That," she said to the class, is Le Chatelier's principle in action. When you apply pressure to a system in equilibrium, it responds by shifting in the opposite direction to relieve that pressure. Marcus groaned and tried to sit up, his face flushed with pain and humiliation. You can single quotes you attacked me. That's assault. Actually, Sarah replied, that was self-defense. You invaded my personal space in a threatening manner after I repeatedly asked you to step back. The entire incident was recorded by the classroom security camera and witnessed by 23 students. Danny, still backing away, pulled out his phone. I'm calling campus security. Please do, Sarah said. I'll be happy to explain to them how you've been systematically sabotaging classroom equipment and endangering student safety. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your techniques. Jessica, who had been silent since screaming, suddenly found her voice. This is insane. You threw a student across the room. They'll fire you for this. Sarah turned her attention to Jessica with the same calm intensity she had shown Marcus. Jessica, I used the minimum force necessary to defend myself against physical intimidation. Marcus was not injured because I controlled the technique precisely. If I had wanted to hurt him, the outcome would have been very different. As if to prove her point, Marcus struggled to his feet, clearly shaken but unharmed. His pride was wounded far more than his body. You're all witnesses, Marcus said to the other students, his voice cracking slightly. She attacked me unprovoked. This is going to destroy her career. Sarah looked around the classroom at the faces of her other students. Some appeared shocked, others impressed, but several were nodding with what looked like approval. Ashley Rodriguez was openly smiling. Let me ask the rest of you something, Sarah said to the class. How many of you have been afraid to participate in discussions because of the constant disruption from these 3 students? How many of you have felt like your education was being compromised by their behavior? Hands began to rise throughout the room. First Ashley, then several others, until more than half the class was acknowledging the toxic atmosphere that had dominated their learning environment. And how many of you have cell phone videos of today's incident that clearly show Marcus advancing toward me in a threatening manner after I asked him to step back? Nearly every hand in the room went up. Sarah nodded with satisfaction. Then I think we have sufficient documentation of what actually occurred here. The classroom door burst open as campus security arrived, summoned by Danny's frantic phone call. 2 officers entered, hands resting on their radio equipment, clearly expecting to find a chaotic situation. Instead, they found a chemistry professor standing calmly beside her whiteboard while a male student sat on the floor looking disheveled and embarrassed. What's the situation here? The lead officer asked. Marcus immediately launched into his version of events, claiming unprovoked assault and demanding Sarah's immediate arrest. Jessica and Danny chimed in with supporting accusations, painting Sarah as an unstable instructor who had violently attacked an innocent student. Sarah waited patiently for them to finish before responding with quiet precision. Officers, I defended myself against physical intimidation after repeated requests for the student to maintain appropriate distance. The entire incident was recorded by the classroom security system and witnessed by 23 students. I used minimal force to neutralize a threatening situation and immediately stopped once the threat was removed. She gestured toward the students. I believe you'll find that the witness testimony supports my account of events. The lead officer looked around the room, noting the expressions on the students' faces. Most appeared supportive of Sarah rather than concerned about Marcus's welfare. We'll need to review the security footage and take statements from everyone present, the officer said. But right now, it looks like we have conflicting accounts of what happened. Sarah nodded calmly. I understand completely. I'll be happy to cooperate fully with your investigation. I believe you'll find that the evidence speaks for itself. As the officers began organizing witness statements, Sarah looked at Marcus, Jessica, and Danny with something that might have been compassion. "You wanted to test my limits," she said quietly. "You wanted to see what would happen if you pushed hard enough. Now you know." The equilibrium had shifted, and there would be no going back. The emergency meeting convened in Dr. Hoffman's office at 8 a.m. the following Monday, exactly 72 hours after the incident that had transformed Sarah Chun from struggling substitute teacher into the most talked-about faculty member at Riverside Community College. Present were Dr. Hoffman's Sarah, the college's legal counsel Robert Martinez, and surprisingly, Dean Patricia Williams, whose presence indicated the seriousness with which the administration was treating the situation. Sarah sat calmly in her chair, wearing a simple gray blazer and carrying a manila folder containing evidence she had meticulously compiled over the past weeks. Across from her, the empty chairs that should have been occupied by Marcus, Jessica, and Danny served as a stark reminder of how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. "Before we begin," Dr. Hoffman said, "I want to acknowledge that this is an unprecedented situation. In 30 years of academic administration, I've never dealt with a case quite like this one." Dean Williams leaned forward, her expression grave but not unsympathetic. "Professor Chun, I've reviewed the preliminary reports from campus security, and I must say the circumstances surrounding Friday's incident are complex." Robert Martinez, the legal counsel, opened his tablet and consulted his notes. "Let's start with what we know definitively. The security footage clearly shows Mr. Rivera approaching you in what any reasonable observer would characterize as an aggressive manner. You asked him to step back twice before taking physical action. The throw you executed resulted in no serious injuries, and you immediately ceased physical contact once he was neutralized." Sarah nodded but remained silent, allowing the administration to present their findings first. "However," Dr. Hoffman continued, "we also have allegations from the 3 students that you had been conducting surveillance on them, that you created a hostile learning environment, and that your response was disproportionate to the threat posed." "I'd like to address those allegations," Sarah said, opening her manila folder. "But first, I think it's important to understand the full scope of what these students were doing." She withdrew a printed timeline that laid out every incident of sabotage, disruption, and intimidation she had documented since her first week of teaching. The document was thorough and methodical, complete with dates, times, witness names, and photographic evidence. This campaign began with simple classroom disruption, but escalated to include technical sabotage, chemical contamination that endangered student safety, and ultimately physical intimidation. Each incident was carefully calculated to push me toward resignation while maintaining their plausible deniability. Dean Williams studied the timeline with growing concern. "Professor Chun, why didn't you report these incidents as they occurred?" "I did report several of them," Sarah replied. "The spitball incident in week 2, the disrupted presentations, the general classroom management issues. Each time, I was told that these were normal challenges that new teachers face, and that I needed to develop better coping strategies." Dr. Hoffman shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly recognizing her own dismissive responses in Sarah's account. Sarah continued, "When the laboratory sabotage occurred, I realized these weren't ordinary classroom disruptions. Someone had deliberately contaminated chemicals in a way that could have seriously injured Ashley Rodriguez or other students. At that point, I began gathering evidence because I knew the next escalation could be even more dangerous." Robert Martinez examined the photographs of the signal interceptor device Sarah had discovered. "This is sophisticated equipment, way beyond typical student pranks. Danny Kowalski has extensive experience with electronics and computer systems," Sarah explained. "He used those skills to systematically disrupt my presentations and eventually to corrupt my laptop's operating system. The device you're looking at was designed to interfere with the classroom's projection network." Dean Williams looked up from the timeline. The laboratory incident is particularly concerning. You're saying they deliberately created a dangerous chemical reaction? Ashley Rodriguez can confirm that Danny Kowalski had access to her experimental materials before the incident occurred. The contamination pattern suggests someone with knowledge of incompatible chemical combinations. It wasn't an accident. The room fell silent as the administrators absorbed the implications. What they had initially viewed as an overreaction to student rudeness was beginning to look like a measured response to systematic harassment and endangerment. "There's something else," Sarah said, withdrawing a printed copy of the anonymous email she had received. Someone else was aware of their coordinated efforts. This message led me to observe their planning session in the third-floor study room, where I witnessed them preparing for Friday's sabotage attempt. Robert Martinez read the email twice. "Do we know who sent this?" "No, but it demonstrates that their activities were visible to other students. This wasn't a secret operation." Dr. Hoffman finally broke her silence. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. When you came to me with concerns about classroom management, I should have taken them more seriously. I failed to recognize the pattern of escalating harassment. The question now," Dean Williams said, "is how we proceed. We have clear evidence of student misconduct that endangered campus safety. We also have video evidence that supports Professor Chen's claim of self-defense. But we still need to address the physical altercation." Robert Martinez closed his tablet. From a legal standpoint, Professor Chen's response appears justified. She used minimal force to defend herself against physical intimidation, and she immediately disengaged once the threat was neutralized. Her Aikido training actually worked in her favor here. A less trained person might have caused serious injury. "What's the status of the 3 students?" Sarah asked. Dr. Hoffman consulted her notes. "Marcus Rivera and Jessica Walsh have withdrawn from the college entirely. Their parents removed them over the weekend, citing concerns about the unsafe learning environment. Danny Kowalski has been suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing." "And the other students in the class?" "That's actually been one of the most interesting developments," Dean Williams said with what might have been a smile. "We've received numerous statements from your students expressing support for your actions. Many of them described feeling intimidated by the trio's behavior and said they were afraid to participate in class discussions." Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with validation. The silent majority of students who had seemed indifferent to the harassment had actually been aware of its impact all along. "There's been another unexpected development," Dr. Hoffman continued. "Your story has attracted attention beyond our campus. The local media got hold of the incident report, and there's been significant public discussion about teacher safety and student accountability." Robert Martinez nodded. "The coverage has been largely positive toward Professor Chen. Many people are viewing this as an example of an educator standing up to bullying and protecting other students. However," Dean Williams said, "we need to establish clear protocols for handling similar situations in the future. While we support Professor Chen's actions in this specific case, we can't have faculty routinely using martial arts techniques on students." Sarah understood the administrative concern. "I only used physical techniques because verbal de-escalation had failed and because I was physically threatened. Aikido teaches us to use the minimum force necessary to resolve conflict safely." "Which brings us to the final matter," Dr. Hoffman said. "Your employment status. Given the circumstances and the evidence you've provided, there will be no disciplinary action against you. In fact, we'd like to offer you a permanent position in the chemistry department." Sarah blinked in surprise. She had been prepared for censure, possibly termination, despite the evidence in her favor. "Professor Williams has decided to extend his medical leave indefinitely," Dean Williams explained. "We need someone to take over his classes permanently, and after reviewing your teaching evaluations from students who weren't involved in this harassment campaign, It's clear you're an excellent educator. The students who completed anonymous evaluations gave you consistently high marks for clarity, preparation, and genuine care for their learning. Dr. Hoffman added, the disruption you experienced wasn't a reflection of your teaching ability. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that her career wasn't ending, validation that her methods were sound, and hope that she could finally teach in an environment free from systematic intimidation. I accept the position, she said simply. There is one condition, Dean Williams said. We'd like you to develop a workshop on conflict de-escalation for faculty and staff. Your experience, both as a victim of harassment and as someone trained in martial arts, could be valuable in helping others handle similar situations. Sarah nodded. I'd be honored to share what I've learned. As the meeting concluded and the administrators filed out, Dr. Hoffman lingered behind. Sarah, I want you to know that what happened here has changed how I view student complaints and faculty concerns. We're implementing new protocols for investigating harassment allegations, and we're taking student safety much more seriously. I appreciate that, Sarah replied. But mostly, I'm just looking forward to teaching chemistry without having to watch my back, Dr. Hoffman smiled. I have a feeling your reputation alone will prevent most future problems. Word has spread that Professor Chun is not someone to be underestimated. Walking back to her office, Sarah reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. A week ago, she had been preparing for possible termination. Now she had job security, administrative support, and the respect of her students. The equilibrium had indeed shifted, but not in the way anyone had expected. 6 months later, Sarah Chun stood before a packed auditorium at the California Community College Faculty Development Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. That would cap off the most transformative period of her professional life. The title of her presentation, Finding Balance, When Martial Arts Principles Meet Educational Challenges, had drawn educators from across the state who wanted to understand how a quiet chemistry professor had become a symbol of teacher empowerment. But first, she reflected on how much had changed since that pivotal Friday morning, when everything had reached its breaking point. The spring semester at Riverside Community College had begun unlike any other in Sarah's experience. Word of the incident had spread throughout the campus community, creating a reputation that preceded her into every classroom. Students arrived for her courses with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and careful attention to proper behavior that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Her introduction to organic chemistry class, once the source of daily stress and systematic harassment, had transformed into one of the most engaged and productive learning environments she had ever experienced. The students who had witnessed the confrontation became natural leaders in maintaining classroom decorum, while new enrollees quickly understood that Professor Chen's gentle demeanor masked both exceptional competence and the ability to respond decisively when necessary. Ashley Rodriguez had become one of Sarah's most dedicated students, eventually deciding to pursue a chemistry major after discovering a genuine passion for the subject. During a conversation in Sarah's office one afternoon in February, Ashley had reflected on how the toxic atmosphere created by Marcus, Jessica, and Danny had affected her entire educational experience. I didn't realize how much anxiety I was carrying every day, Ashley had said. Walking into that classroom used to fill me with dread because I never knew what kind of disruption or humiliation they would create. After you dealt with them, it was like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying just disappeared. Ashley's transformation was representative of changes Sarah observed throughout the semester. Students who had previously remained silent during discussions began participating actively. Laboratory exercises proceeded smoothly without fear of sabotage or chemical contamination. Most importantly, the learning environment became collaborative rather than adversarial, with students supporting each other's success instead of competing for social dominance. The workshop program that Dean Williams had requested Sarah to develop had exceeded all expectations. Conflict de-escalation through centered awareness had initially been designed as a single-day training session for faculty and staff. However, demand from other institutions had led to a series of presentations at education conferences throughout California and neighboring states. The workshop drew on Aikido principles to teach educators how to recognize escalating tensions, maintain emotional equilibrium under pressure, and respond to challenging situations with clarity rather than reactivity. Sarah emphasized that physical techniques were only the most extreme application of these principles. The real value lay in the mental discipline and situational awareness that martial arts training provided. Dr. Hoffman had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates, often introducing her at conferences with a story about her own learning experience. "I spent 30 years in academic administration, thinking I understood student-faculty dynamics," she would say. "Professor Chun taught me that sometimes what we dismiss as normal challenges are actually systematic patterns of harassment that we have a responsibility to address." The broader impact of Sarah's story had reached far beyond Riverside Community College. A feature article in the Chronicle of Higher Education had sparked national conversations about teacher safety, student accountability, and the importance of supporting educators who face systematic harassment. Sarah had been invited to speak at dozens of conferences and workshops, sharing her experience and the lessons she had learned about maintaining professional integrity under pressure. But perhaps the most significant changes had occurred in Sarah's personal relationship with her martial arts practice. The confrontation with Marcus had forced her to integrate her Aikido training with her professional life in ways she had never previously considered. Working with her sensei, Michael Tanaka, she had developed a deeper understanding of how the principles of harmony and centered awareness applied to all aspects of human interaction. "The dojo teaches us to blend with an opponent's energy," Tanaka had explained during one of their sessions. "But in daily life, opponents often attack indirectly, through manipulation, deception, or systematic undermining. The same principles apply, but the techniques must be adapted to match the nature of the attack." Sarah had begun teaching a weekly Aikido class at Riverside, open to students, faculty, and staff. The program had grown from 5 participants to over 40, creating a community of practice that extended far beyond self-defense techniques. Participants often commented on how the training helped them manage stress, maintain focus during difficult situations, and respond to challenges with greater confidence and clarity. One unexpected participant was Danny Kowalski. After his suspension and subsequent disciplinary hearing, Danny had been readmitted to the college with strict conditions, including anger management counseling and community service. He had approached Sarah nervously during her office hours in March, asking if he could join the Aikido program. "I know you have every reason to refuse," he had said, unable to make eye contact. "But I need to learn how to handle conflict without trying to destroy people. What we did to you was wrong, and I want to understand how to be different." Sarah had been surprised by Danny's request, but after consulting with Tanaka and reflecting on Aikido's emphasis on transformation rather than punishment, she had agreed to let him participate. Danny's progress had been remarkable. His technical aptitude for electronics was matched by a genuine commitment to personal growth. He had become one of the most dedicated students in the program, often staying after class to help clean the training space and assist newer participants. "Aikido taught me that I can be strong without making other people weak," Danny had written in a reflection essay for his sociology class. "Professor Chun could have destroyed my life after what I did to her, but instead, she gave me a chance to become a better person. That's what real strength looks like." Marcus Rivera and Jessica Walsh had not been seen at Riverside since their withdrawal, but Sarah had heard through campus gossip that both had struggled to adjust at their new institutions. Marcus had been suspended from a community college in San Diego for similar disruptive behavior, while Jessica had reportedly dropped out entirely after failing to establish the social dominance she had enjoyed at Riverside. Their absence had created space for other students to emerge as positive leaders in the classroom community. Sarah had observed how toxic individuals could suppress the natural collaborative tendencies of groups, and how removing that toxicity allowed healthier dynamics to flourish. The legal aftermath of the incident had been resolved without any formal charges being filed. Marcus's father, Police Sergeant Rivera, had initially threatened to pursue assault charges against Sarah, but the overwhelming evidence supporting her self-defense claim had made such action impossible. The district attorney's office had reviewed the case and concluded that Sarah's response was entirely justified given the circumstances. More importantly, the incident had prompted Riverside to review and update its policies regarding student harassment of faculty. The new protocols included mandatory reporting of systematic disruption, enhanced security camera coverage in classrooms, and clear consequences for students who created hostile learning environments. Sarah's transformation from struggling substitute teacher to respected educator and workshop leader had not gone unnoticed by her family. Her brother David had attended one of her conference presentations and been amazed by her poise and authority in front of large audiences. "I remember when you were afraid to speak up in family dinner conversations," he had told her. "Now you're commanding the attention of hundreds of educators and teaching them about courage and resilience. It's incredible to see how much you've grown." Her parents, who had initially been concerned about the confrontation and its potential consequences, had become her proudest supporters. They attended every local presentation Sarah gave, marveling at how their quiet daughter had found her voice through the integration of martial arts, principles, and educational practice. As Sarah stood before the conference audience, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The attack on her authority and dignity had initially seemed like a crisis that might end her teaching career. Instead, it had become the catalyst for discovering strengths and capabilities she had never known she possessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I want to start with a fundamental principle from Aikido. Every attack contains the seeds of its own defeat. When we learn to blend with aggressive energy instead of meeting it with resistance, we can redirect that force in ways that serve harmony rather than destruction." She clicked to her first slide, which showed the Chinese character for crisis, a combination of the symbols for danger and opportunity. 6 months ago, I was a new teacher facing systematic harassment from students who believed they could intimidate me into resignation. They attacked my presentations, sabotaged my equipment, and endangered other students through their actions. At the time, it felt like my career was under siege. Murmurs of recognition rippled through the audience. Many educators had faced similar challenges, though perhaps not as extreme as Sarah's experience. But that crisis forced me to integrate 20 years of martial arts training with my educational practice in ways I had never considered. The same principles that taught me to redirect physical aggression could be applied to psychological intimidation, academic sabotage, and systemic harassment. Sarah spent the next 45 minutes walking the audience through her experience, analyzing each phase of the conflict through the lens of Aikido principles. She explained how centering techniques had helped her maintain clarity under pressure, how awareness training had allowed her to gather evidence of the harassment campaign, and how the philosophy of minimal necessary force had guided her response during the physical confrontation. "The throw I executed on Marcus Rivera lasted less than 3 seconds, she said, showing the security camera footage that had become central evidence in the case. But the principles behind that technique, timing, balance, and redirected energy, had been guiding my responses throughout the entire conflict." She emphasized that physical technique should always be the last resort, used only when verbal de-escalation had failed and when there was genuine threat of harm. The real value of martial arts training for educators lay in the mental discipline, situational awareness, and emotional equilibrium that such practice developed. Aikido teaches us that true victory doesn't come from defeating opponents, but from transforming conflict into harmony, Sarah explained. In educational settings, this means creating environments where disruptive students can choose growth over destruction, where conflicts become opportunities for learning, and where everyone involved can emerge stronger than before. She shared Danny Kowalski's transformation as an example of how even the most problematic students could change when given appropriate boundaries and opportunities for redemption. Danny is now one of my most dedicated Aikido students and has become a positive leader in our campus community, Sarah said. That transformation was only possible because I responded to his attacks with discipline rather than retaliation, creating space for him to choose a different path. The audience was captivated by Sarah's integration of martial arts philosophy with practical educational strategies. During the question and answer session, educators shared their own experiences with classroom disruption and asked for specific techniques they could apply in their institutions. Dr. Linda Martinez, a psychology professor from Sacramento, asked about the ethical implications of using martial arts training against students. How do we balance the need for classroom authority with the responsibility to nurture student development? That's the fundamental question, Sarah replied. Aikido emphasizes that we should use no more force than necessary to resolve a conflict safely. In most educational situations, that means verbal boundaries, clear consequences, and administrative support. Physical techniques should only be used when there's a genuine threat of harm, and even then, the goal is to neutralize the threat while preserving the possibility for future relationships. Professor James Williams from Fresno asked about institutional support for faculty facing harassment. What changes have you seen in how administrators respond to these situations? My experience has led to significant policy changes at Riverside, Sarah answered. Administrators now take reports of systematic harassment much more seriously, and we have clear protocols for documenting and addressing problematic behavior before it escalates to crisis points. The key is recognizing patterns early and responding decisively while the situation can still be resolved through non-physical means. The final question came from a young instructor who appeared nervous about her own classroom challenges. What advice would you give to new teachers who feel overwhelmed by disruptive students? Sarah paused thoughtfully before responding. First, trust your instincts. If something feels systematically wrong rather than occasionally challenging, it probably is. Document everything, seek support from colleagues and administrators, and remember that maintaining classroom boundaries isn't about controlling students. It's about creating safe spaces where everyone can learn and grow. She added, most importantly, remember that your strength doesn't come from never being challenged. It comes from how you respond when you are challenged. Every crisis contains opportunities for growth, both for yourself and for the students involved. As the presentation concluded and audience members approached for individual conversations, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The journey from harassment victim to empowered educator had been difficult and sometimes frightening, but it had revealed capabilities and strengths she might never have discovered otherwise. Later that evening, as she drove back to Riverside, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. She was no longer the quiet, retiring person who had hoped to blend into the background of academic life. She had found her voice, claimed her authority, and learned to stand in her power. Without apology. The next morning brought a new semester, new students, and new opportunities to apply everything she had learned. As Sarah unlocked her classroom and began preparing for her first lecture on molecular structures, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had mastered the art of finding balance in any situation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Ashley Rodriguez, now in her second year of chemistry studies. Good luck with the new semester, Professor Chun. Thanks for showing us what real strength looks like. Sarah smiled as she arranged her molecular models and checked her presentation equipment. Everything was working perfectly, and she knew it would stay that way. Not because she could guarantee the absence of challenges, but because she had learned to meet whatever came with centered awareness, appropriate responses, and the unshakable knowledge that harmony could be maintained even in the midst of conflict. As students began arriving for class, Sarah greeted each one with genuine warmth and attention. Some were returning students who already understood the standard of respect and engagement she maintained, while others were new faces who would learn quickly how a classroom could function when everyone committed to creating a positive learning environment. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah said as the clock reached 9 a.m. "Today we're going to explore the fascinating world of chemical bonding, how individual atoms overcome their isolation to create stable, beautiful, and incredibly diverse molecular structures. It's a perfect metaphor for how separate individuals can come together to create something greater than the sum of their parts." As she clicked to her first slide and began the semester's journey into the elegant logic of chemistry, Sarah embodied the principles she had spent months learning to apply: centered awareness, appropriate response, and the patient confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. The equilibrium was perfect, and it would remain that way as long as she continued applying the lessons that had transformed crisis into triumph, conflict into growth, and intimidation into unshakable strength. In the back of the classroom, a new student raised her hand with an eager question about electron sharing, and Sarah smiled as she recognized the beginning of another beautiful transformation, not just of chemical understanding, but of human potential unleashed in an environment where respect, curiosity, and mutual support created the perfect conditions for learning to flourish. The story that had begun with sabotage and humiliation had become a testament to the power of principles, preparation, and the courage to stand firm when standing firm was what the situation required. Sarah Chun had learned to find balance not by avoiding conflict, but by meeting it with such perfect centeredness that harmony emerged naturally from chaos. And in that harmony, everyone, teacher and students alike, found room to grow into their best possible selves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.